Hello. Today I'm going to talk about my thoughts on the Gnostic Soul Trap's purpose, and I'm also going to touch a little bit on this idea of Loosh, which is a kind of psycho-etheric energy, I guess is the best way to describe it. This is going to be another deep dive into Gnosticism, so if you're not familiar with this outlook, you should check out my playlist and get more acquainted with it. But this video is going to be kind of two parts. The first is I'm going to discuss just some things that have been on my mind and also a little bit about Loosh. And then I'm going to dive into a mind map that I created trying to sort out the purpose of the soul trap. Before I get into it though, I want to say a few things about the Demiurge. Because I'm a writer, I tend to really go deep into research on things, especially if it pertains to anything I'm working on. And tangentially, this does pertain to the current project I'm diving into. So lately it's been heavily on my mind, trying to kind of sort out my view on it. I think it's a very complicated subject. I was going over my notes and I discovered a quote. Unfortunately, I don't know where I got it from. I just jotted it down. It goes something along the lines of this: in the act of creation, the Demiurge emptied himself of his supreme power. And this idea of emptying himself really just struck me, because I think we kind of think of when things are created that it's just sort of made. And as someone that has done art, I know that things are never just made. You have materials that you have to kind of either destroy to make something new with, or that you have to kind of reform into something else. And based upon this quote, it makes me wonder about Sophia as an emanation of the monad, and then the Demiurge is an emanation of Sophia, but an error. So is this error already part of the material? And the Demiurge has created the universe from his own materiality, let's say. Now, they often say that the Demiurge is like rejected or abandoned or an abortion, and that's where in some of the sects they say that that's where the rage or the wrath comes from. But they also talk about the emptiness, that there's this need to fill the Demiurge, as if it's almost a negative that has to be filled by a positive. The first thing that hit me when I started thinking more deeply about this is, do gods have emotions? We often say that we are like the microcosmic version of the macrocosm, and we have emotions. So do higher beings also have emotions? If they do, then how would he feel about this? How would he feel about giving everything of himself to create this place, and then knowing that he's sort of hit the limits of his material manifestation, and he kind of reconstituted everything from his own self? And then it got me to thinking, well, if he is made of material, let's say, does he end up dying like his creation? Is he mortal in some way? Now, when I say that, I don't mean like our lifespan. I mean, it could be several thousand years, could be what we might perceive as eternity. But that is a fundamental distinction there, because when we think of God, we think of eternal, right? That it's all and that it will never die. So if the Demiurge can die, well, when? And what happens to us if he does? So those are all kind of abstract ideas. However, this empty God idea started really getting in my head, and I started thinking about Loosh energy, which I'll explain in a second. But it hit me that this idea of the archons and the Demiurge needing energy from us, fear and ignorance, passion, these energetic states, to fill up the emptiness. Now, I find that very interesting because, there's a lot of videos online that talk about human beings being like batteries, and you even see it in the Matrix. I think a lot of the way that they discuss that is that we're like a fuel. Our emotions and stuff are like a fuel to keep it running. But having latched onto this idea of the empty God, I don't really see it that way now. I kind of see it as almost vampiric, to the point of like the Demiurge will never be fulfilled. It's not even about keep going or keep running. It's more about, it's kind of like an addiction. You know, when a person has an addiction, they have some kind of hole that they're trying to fill. And no matter what they do, no matter how much they take, the hole is never quite filled. That's why when people go into recovery and stuff, there's always this idea that you have to find out what that hole is. Because once you find out the hole, then you can kind of repair yourself. But if the Demiurge was left with this emptiness, this hole, it is nearly eternal. It may be trying to fill this hole forever. And so we're just like locked in this thing where we're feeding its addiction. Let's talk a bit about Loosh energy. So the concept of Loosh is a term that originates from the work of Robert Monroe, an American author and consciousness researcher best known for his studies of out-of-body experiences. Monroe introduced the idea of Loosh in his 1971 book, Journeys Out of the Body, where he described it as a kind of spiritual energy harvested from human emotions. And there are precursors of this in a lot of literature way before him. You know, all of the vampiric folklore, kind of energy vampirism, even the work of H.P. Lovecraft. If you think of his mythos, these cosmic entities are kind of feeding on human fear and despair. And I also find this interesting, especially if you look at the Demiurge as a kind of addict. Addicts often shirk their morality in favor of the feeding of their addiction. So now I'm going to walk you through a deep dive I did the other night. You know, sometimes when I'm trying to sort out something for a project, I'll just start making a mind map and getting my thoughts more organized. Well, I've created this one and I made it into a PDF. There's a link in the description if you want to download it for your own purposes. I wanted to see how the different groups view the Demiurge or the Soul Trap. So I did some research and I started with 3 questions. So, how the sect transcends the trap, what is the material world or reality according to them, and why are we trapped here? And they're color-coded, and as you can see, I've started with the sect's name, like Sethian, and then I've gone into like how they see the Demiurge and whether it's malevolent or benevolent or kind of just ignorant. And then I break it into the 3 questions here. So in the case of the Sethians, they think of transcending the trap as salvation through gnosis. The material world is a prison for enslaved souls. And why are we trapped here? It's a recycling of souls, or kind of loosh, and reincarnation. I go through and I do this for a lot of the different sects. I didn't do every sect. If you look on Wikipedia, there are hundreds of different Gnostic sects. But these are kind of the main roots. And I even included Platonic and Neoplatonic because they kind of see it as more benevolent. But if you download the PDF, you can look more deeply. I'm not going to go over every nuance of this, but it did definitely allow me to see the differences between the different sects. And I mean, it definitely ranges from kind of ignorant or misguided in the case of the Valentinians to malevolent or hostile in the case of the Ophite. I definitely think the Platonic and Neoplatonic see it very differently than the rest of the sects. But there are definitely still similarities in terms of the hierarchy and stuff. So once I kind of got my head around that, I started going through the questions. And the first question I had is, what is the purpose? Now, there are many things, many possibilities that it could be. And obviously, maybe I didn't think of them all, but this is what I came up with. The first would be some kind of cosmic test. But then if there's a cosmic test, why? What's the purpose of the test? And you could jump over here and say it's to purify souls. I'll get more into that in a second. There could also be cosmic equilibrium, like we need to be here for there to be some kind of balance. I think that's a possibility, especially in terms of the Platonic and Neoplatonic worldview. They kind of see us as an emanation from the forms, and that we are a logical kind of end to these higher spiritual forms, so we're kind of on the lower end of the spectrum. But I also started thinking about this. Is it just for malevolence sake? That's kind of a dark viewpoint, but it is a possibility. Or is it to enslave souls for some kind of petty dominion, some kind of power trip? Also a possibility. As far as Loosh, it could be some kind of parasitic function, like Demiurge needs us to survive. Like I said earlier about an addiction, could be something like that. It could also be continue the cycle of reincarnation. But again, why? Why do we have to keep doing it over and over again? Well, that leads to this question, why keep us trapped? And in terms of purifying souls, it would be to strengthen the soul for some purpose. But again, what is that purpose? In a lot of religious texts, they say, you're trying to become your best self to prepare yourself for an afterlife. Well, I don't really think the Gnostics look at it that way. So why else would you strengthen your soul? Another possibility to keep us trapped is to suppress spiritual awakening as some kind of block to prevent liberation. But then, why? Why does it want to keep us here? I mean, it could be the Loosh thing as far as like this vampiric addiction, or there might be another purpose. There's also this one, to educate. Maybe we're trapped here to learn lessons, which jumps back to this kind of cosmic test. And again, why? Another possibility is maybe the trap is an illusion. And this goes back into like Maya and stuff, trying to see through the illusion of reality. If the material world is an illusion, I don't quite understand why it would exist. I mean, I know it would be to fool us into thinking that it is the ultimate reality, kind of. And people that have no spiritual connection to the world probably believe this. Then it jumps into punishment. Maybe this is an actual hell, condemnation. And I'll jump into that in a second because it gets a little more complicated. But it could be to maintain spiritual hierarchy. This would be more of the Platonic and Neoplatonic worldview. It's kind of, we have to work to maintain the power structure. As far as the punishment, this goes back into the idea of the Demiurge being an error. There's some kind of divine fall. And you could say that the Demiurge fell kind of from grace, and then we fell from grace from the Demiurge in a way. So it's sort of an error of an error. And if you think about it this way, it makes a lot of sense. The Demiurge is trying to contain kind of a fallout, almost like a nuclear meltdown. If you have this error and you don't contain it, then it could spread to everything. I mean, I don't know. That's one way to look at it. I mean, obviously, if the monad is all powerful, it would be able to somehow stop it, and perhaps it has, and maybe that is how we're trying to break through. Or in the last video I talked about zebra trying to communicate with us, maybe through the barrier of this error that's blocking the error from consuming everything else. Well, after that I started thinking, what is the nature of the Demiurge? The simplest one is kind of architect. And you could say that any architect wants to have pride in their work and kind of show it off or show their power that they created it, But then we get into some other ideas about this. Let's do benevolence first. If this is the Platonic, Neoplatonic, the best case scenario is within the limitations of matter. So we are kind of, even though it could be considered an error, which I don't think they actually saw it as an error. I think they saw it as just a natural hierarchy. We just happen to be at the bottom of it. But it is a limitation. In their viewpoint, they're talking about gaining as much wisdom, spiritual wisdom, through contemplation, this kind of philosophical outlook, that you're able to transcend these limitations. I kind of think maybe I lean more towards this one, that there's an ignorance involved. Because in my mind, I kind of see that the Demiurge is just a reflection of us. If you think of the Old Testament God as the Demiurge, it is a lot about ego and demanding worship. And I think that's a very human quality. And I think humans kind of dwell in ignorance. I mean, we try to transcend it, but we're kind of prisoners to it, I think. So the ignorance is a source of tyranny, keeping us trapped here. The Demiurge may have a Valentinian redemption as it evolves with us. So in that case, you know, through life we're trying to evolve and we're trying to learn more and we're trying to somehow get some grace. Perhaps it is also doing that, but like human beings, it has this ignorance and it does have an ego. So maybe through the ages it will transcend its ego. I don't know. A darker version would be arrogance. It believes it's the one true God, and we must bend the knee for the king. That could also be a possibility. But now we're getting into a darker kind of version of reality if we go down this route. And that's ending with malevolence. And this is kind of where I really got stuck the other night, just really grappling with all these questions about that. So I came up with this idea that if it's malevolent, then it could have sort of a narcissistic or psychopathic viewpoint. And if that's the case, then there's a lot of problems. First being lack of empathy. If the monad, zebra, the true God, is love and acceptance and all these things and kind of balance, if you've ever known a narcissist, they are anything but balance. And so this lack of empathy causes drama, causes all kinds of problems. And then it becomes this thing of abuse for abuse's sake. And you could say this is kind of a masochistic thing. Again, if you've known any narcissists, they kind of feed off emotional energy. In this case, you could also say psychic energy. Loosh. Let's go down that road for a second. So, because they do that, there's this need for control so they can get more emotional energy, which in turn turns into manipulation over whatever it is that they're feeding off of. And then from there turns into exploitation. They exploit it as much as possible, or as much as the victim is willing to allow. Narcissists have a false sense of reality. They always say, I'm the center of the universe. They have the inability to see their own flaws, and they have a fragile ego. Old Testament God. They also have a distorted sense of self, which, if you look into the Gnostic texts, the Demiurge does do that. There's self-importance, you must worship me, and there's also entitlement. The fact that it is entitled to our energy. And if you think about it, you know, people often say, oh, you know, moral rights and freedoms, and, you know, that's something that is often touted in government and politics. But here, if this is true, if the Gnostic worldview is true, we have no freedom. And the Demiurge is entitled to take from us. So it leaves us kind of powerless unless you are able to transcend it. Now, once I kind of got into that, then I said, how can we escape the trap? The different Gnostics had different ways of looking at this, but I would say the ultimate thing that they agree upon is gnosis, esoteric knowledge, spiritual knowledge. And if you go down that path, so recognizing the deception of the senses, the more awake you become, the more you realize this. And that turns into kind of two things: a rejecting of worldly desires, which I see as two-sided. I mean, you could say I'm a bit of a hedonist, but there are definitely worldly desires that I enjoy. You know, good cookie or, making love or some kind of Dionysian excess. I mean, all those things can lead to a lot of pleasure. Ultimately, maybe they lead to suffering in the end, but they are part of physical life. And rejecting them is kind of a strange thing when you really deeply think about it. It's like rejecting life in a way. But then there's also this embracing the divine emissaries, the Christ, Sophia. In Platonic and Neoplatonic, they would say the daemons, which are kind of like guiding spirits, higher versions of yourself, which leads to resisting the archons and the temptations. But again, like I said, if you're resisting these temptations, are you even really truly living anymore? Or are you living a very diminished material life, using mantras or symbols to bypass archonic control? Years ago, I got into kind of ceremonial magic and, using thought forms and stuff to kind of influence my reality, and I can see how this could definitely work, but I never really thought about using it to block the archons. So that is definitely an interesting way to look at that. And, that leads me to these last three kind of threads of this question. One is mystical practices, contemplation, and direct experience. So with mystical practices, you could use all these different things: mantras, symbols, meditation, purification, like through fasts and things, or abstinence, detachment from the material world, which goes back to rejecting worldly desires again, or maybe not even rejecting them, but just not being attached to them, still experiencing them, but not having this greed about them. In contemplation, it's kind of this inner reflection. I said in the last video that Philip K. Dick was talking about going in instead of up to the divine. And this could be a thing where the more that you reflect and the more meditation you do, the further in you can go, which in turn overcomes your ego. And then that in turn has this self-inquiry. Who am I really? Am I my ego? And this actually poses one question for me, is if we're like a lower form of life than the Demiurge, and we can be aware of this, why hasn't the Demiurge become aware of it or tried to transcend its ego? That is a question I don't know if there's an answer for, but it's definitely something that popped into my head. So with direct experience, there are some positive things that can happen. You gain compassion. You can use it for service. I think those that have suffered more tend to lean in this direction. They have more compassion than those that have not suffered. If you have suffered a lot, I think you tend to see the rest of the world as people that are suffering, and you have more empathy for them, which again goes back to the Demiurge. Why doesn't the Demiurge have more empathy for us? Or does it? If you're looking at the Platonic, Neoplatonic, maybe it does, but in all the other worldviews, it does not. So the last thing that I considered was, does the trap have a purpose beyond keeping us here? The immediate one is the Loosh farm, that it needs this energy, so they're keeping us here as like batteries. And in a lot of different videos and books, they talk about not going towards the light when you die and trying to escape that trap. that's set up, and that could be a condition of this, which also leads to this, that there's a false pathway, that the Demiurge is trying to trick us into not going towards enlightenment or not going towards the monad. So it creates all these false roads. And then, yeah, that becomes a nefarious block from enlightenment. So why do that? Why keep us here? The only reason I could think of is the Loosh, is the energy and the worship. If you can think of some kind of other reason, you can comment below about what that might be. But one thing I thought of is that maybe the Demiurge fears its own disillusionment, its own destruction. And that would be a very human thing to grapple with as a higher being, because we all do that. We all fear our own destruction. Another thing is that maybe it's trying to maintain the illusion of duality for whatever reason. If the monad is all, then it transcends duality. And maybe the Demiurge needs duality to exist. I'm not sure. And the last one is false dominion. It wants us to think that it has dominion over us. In the end, I know that poses many questions and gives few answers again, but I just wanted to sort it out a bit in my head. The problem I have is that there are all these different sects and they all believe slightly different things. Which one is right? And yeah, I mean, that's probably not something that anyone will ever know. Or if we do know, we'll already be gone from this place. Based off of what I gathered from my research, I think it's a mix of all of them. I mean, I think the Neoplatonic and Platonic viewpoint has something to it, this kind of hierarchy, and that is part of the cosmic order. So, I think in a lot of religions, there's this idea of heaven and the physical world and hell, but I definitely think this kind of pushing from the lowest to the highest, which is a kind of a Rosicrucian idea. In Rosicrucianism, they often talk about the vibration of rocks and then, plants and animals and so on. This kind of evolved consciousness where the higher you go, or the more up the hierarchy you go, the more developed of a consciousness you have. So in that way, I think the Neoplatonic and Platonic viewpoints are accurate. If you combine that with the more Gnostic ideas, I kind of lean towards the idea, like I said before, that the Demiurge is almost like a child, and it's causing suffering out of ignorance. Maybe I want to think that way because I don't want to think that this thing just wants to hurt us or cause us suffering intentionally. Because if that's the case, then I don't know. It's a pretty dour outlook. Yeah, so anyway, that's all I got for this. Maybe there's more answers somewhere in the middle of all these viewpoints. If you have anything to chime in about this, you can put that in the comments, or if there's some questions that you think I should address in future videos, you can also put them in the comments and I will see what I can do about that. But that's all I got for today. Take care. Have a good day.